17 strange arrows found across America. Number 17. The Golconda Concrete Arrow. This concrete arrow can be found in Golconda, which is in the Humboldt County of Nevada. You might have noticed that these arrows are located out in the middle of nowhere, seemingly serving absolutely no purpose. Well, they actually served a purpose, but not as landmarks for people on foot, but for those traveling by air. Number 16. The Bloomington Concrete Arrow. These isolated concrete arrows served as guideposts for airplanes delivering mail. In the days before consistent radio technology, vehicles traveling through the air would have little to no contact with people on land and during those cross-country flights. In order to stay on track, large arrows were constructed along flight paths all the way through the country. This arrow is found in Bloomington, an area in southern Utah, and has stayed in relatively good shape over the century. Number 15. The Moat Concrete Arrow. Not all of the concrete arrows have stayed in good condition over the years, however, like this arrow that can be found by a highway in Moat, Nevada, which has visibly weathered and decayed. Every year, the cracks become more apparent and nature begins to retake its space. They are slowly looking more and more like ruins from a distant time rather than a piece of recent history. Number 14. The Poverty Point Concrete Arrows. While hundreds of these concrete arrows have become obsolete and are slowly being forgotten and lost to time, many of them are still being kept alive by a few hobbyists. Like this concrete arrow found in Poverty Point, Utah, which has been catalogued by retired couple Brian and Charlotte Smith. Number 13. The Thayer Junction Concrete Arrow. This pointer can be found at Thayer Junction in Wyoming, which like the rest of these arrows can be found in the middle of nowhere desert near a railroad. The reason many of these arrows are found in the featureless desert rather than anywhere interesting is because they are more useful out in the boondocks. When mail delivery pilots were navigating through America, they often did it from landmark to landmark. This didn't work when traveling through the featureless American deserts. Number 12. The Medicine Bow Concrete Arrow. This arrow is another photo under the belt of the Smiths, and one that's more distinct than the other ones. The light fixture on this arrow remains intact. If you were wondering how pilots could see those concrete arrows in the dark or during inclement weather, this is how. Towers with spinning, flashing lights would illuminate the arrow and serve as an easily visible marker on low visibility days. Number 11. New Mexico Arrow and Beacon. Finding one of these concrete navigational arrows intact, complete with the beacon at all, is a rare experience, while finding them in good condition is even rarer. This arrow and beacon landmark in New Mexico is incredibly lucky to still be standing. Number 10. Abandoned Lighthouse. Many of these constructions have not only fallen to the tides of time, but a lot of them were specifically taken apart during World War II to use as scrap metal in a time where resources were very limited. Most of the huts, which stored the generators that supplied power to the light towers, have been torn down or become dilapidated. But this one in the middle of the desert has mostly survived its journey through the last 100 years. Number 9. The Split Arrows in Walnut Creek, California. Some of the arrows wouldn't just point to the nearest airstrip or towards the next arrow. Sometimes they would split into two tails and two heads, like this navigation point that you can see near Walnut Creek, California. A split arrow would indicate a split in the route or a point where two paths would merge. Back in the day, these arrows were painted bright yellow, but since their heyday in the early 30s, the yellow has faded and been replaced with graffiti. Number 8. The Northern Nevada Arrow. Some arrows are bent at angles rather than straight lines, like this concrete arrow in the middle of the northern Nevada wasteland, which turns at a right angle. An arrow like this denotes a directional change in the air route for a plane. Seeing something like this really illustrates how rudimentary the system was. Imagine flying economy from New York to California, where you have to hope your pilot can see the big arrows on the ground to get you to the right place at the right time. It almost feels cartoonish. Number 7. The Lake Point Beacon. This navigational aid is found in Lake Point, Utah. It points towards Salt Lake City, the nearest airway and landmark from this point. Obviously, this is one of the arrows that have fallen as time passes. The light tower that once stood here is now scrapped and long gone, leaving behind only a cracked concrete foundation being overtaken by plant growth. Number 6. The Albuquerque Arrow. This arrow, west of Albuquerque, is a lonely relic of a time before radio. It's an isolated concrete landmark out in the middle of nowhere, which would look really mysterious if you weren't aware of the history of these things. They almost remind me of the same impression you get from Stonehenge, a mysterious man-made monument seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Number 5. The Concrete Arrow near Anthony, Kansas. Some of the arrows have come to be surrounded by newer establishments as populations have grown and spread to new areas since their initial construction. This arrow near Anthony, Kansas Kansas has slowly turned into a landmark that points not towards the nearest airway, but a tree instead. Its usefulness has definitely expired, but if you really need to find this specific tree in the middle of Kansas, we have the landmark for you. Number 4. The Crooked Arrow in Toole County, Utah. Some of these beacons found across the country don't really follow that old phrase about being as straight as an arrow. Many of them are actually slightly crooked or curved, indicating a slight change in the route. Like most things, you can't always drive a straight beeline from point A to point B. Number 3. The Meacham Arrow. This arrow in Meacham, Oregon, is no longer in the middle of a random field. It now sits beside a random isolated house. Many of the places that were too desolate and unremarkable that needed the arrows in the first place have actually remained pretty undeveloped over the years. Number 2. The Minneapolis Arrow. This arrow in Minneapolis has actually become really hard to see from the sky and is now mostly obscured by residential buildings and trees. However, it is still a very easily seen landmark from the ground. Now it doesn't actually serve any real functional purpose as it was originally built. It is now a slightly glorified lawn decoration with an interesting origin story, far removed from its glorious life as a waypoint for pilots. Number 1. The arrow southeast of Indianapolis. Most of these arrows, despite being in more developed areas, are still visible from the sky. This one, just southeast of Indianapolis, makes a really striking image in a geometric landscape, pointing towards a rigid concrete parking lot for nobody except onlookers seeing them through satellite imaging.